When I first heard about the photograph, it was merely a curiosity shared over coffee by a retired archivist from the County Historical Society. He had a way of telling stories as if each one were a thread that, if pulled hard enough, might unravel something no one was ready to see. This one, he said, began in 1911 in the small coastal town of Windermere, Maine. At first glance, the image seemed simple. A little girl, no older than 6, stood in front of her family's boarding house, holding a doll. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon, her shoes worn but neatly polished, and her eyes gazed just off to the side of the camera lens. Nothing appeared remarkable until you noticed the doll. Its porcelain face was unnervingly detailed for a child's toy. The eyes were set slightly too deep, and the painted lips curved in a smile that felt knowing. And then there was the shadow at the girl's feet. Faint, yet unmistakable. It did not belong to her or the doll, but to something neither the photographer nor the family could explain. The girl's name was Eleanor Duval. The boarding house behind her, the Harrow Gate, had stood at the edge of town for only 10 years, a modest structure with sea-weathered shingles and a wraparound porch. The photograph was taken on the morning of June 3, 1911, just before Eleanor's father left to pick up guests arriving by train. It would be the last clear image anyone ever took of her. I learned the photograph had been rediscovered in 2023 when a box of glass negatives was donated to the Windermere Historical Archive. Using a high-resolution scanner, archivists enlarged the image, and that's when the unease began. Zooming in revealed tiny details no one in 1911 could have seen. The doll's pupils contained faint shapes resembling human figures, and the shadow at Eleanor's feet had the form of an outstretched hand. The archivist explained that in the weeks following the photograph, Eleanor vanished from her home without a trace. Search parties combed the town, the surrounding woods, and the rocky shoreline. No body was ever found, and no ransom note ever arrived. Some whispered that the sea had claimed her. Others believed something within the boarding house had. At the time, the incident was quietly noted in county records as a probable accident. But over the decades, that single photograph became the centerpiece of countless local legends. The more I learned, the more I realized Windermere's history was entangled with something far older and darker than the townsfolk cared to admit. The archivist leaned closer, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. It wasn't just the girl who disappeared, he said. It was the doll. No one ever saw it again. A few years later, however, someone swore they glimpsed its face in another photograph. That is where this story turns. If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you discovered a century-old photograph containing details no one could explain? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss where this story leads. What came next was far stranger than I expected. I didn't sleep well that night. The image of Eleanor and that unsettling doll lingered in my mind like the metallic aftertaste of something forbidden. By morning, I knew I couldn't let the story remain a local curiosity. I called the archivist and asked to see the original glass negative for myself. He hesitated, not out of secrecy, but because he seemed genuinely uncertain whether showing it to me was wise. When I arrived at the Windermere Historical Archive, the building itself felt as if plucked from another time. Brick walls weathered by salt air, tall arched windows that strained daylight into dusty beams. Mr. Calloway, the archivist, met me at the door carrying a padded box, the kind reserved for rare documents. Inside lay the fragile glass plate. Even without the scanner's magnification, I could see the faint distortion around Eleanor's feet. In person, it was worse. The shadow had an odd depth, as if captured in layers. The longer I stared, the more the shape seemed to want to move. Calloway explained that the glass plate had been found at the bottom of the donation box, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from 1932. There had been no note, no indication of who donated it. The rest of the negatives in the box were ordinary street scenes, family portraits, and landscapes. Only this one carried a sense of intrusion. We pulled the town records from the year Eleanor disappeared. The Duval family had arrived in Windermere from Portland in 1901, purchasing the Harrow Gate boarding house with money from a distant inheritance. They had 2 children, Eleanor and her older brother, Francis. But Francis had died of pneumonia 3 years before the photograph was taken. In the months leading up to Eleanor's disappearance, quiet rumors appeared in the local paper about unusual disturbances at the Harrow Gate. Guests reported knocks on their doors at impossible hours, objects moving from one room to another, and mirrors fogging over without any source of steam. One guest even claimed to have woken to the sound of a child singing in a language she did not know, though no children were booked in the house at the time. What struck me most, however, was the police report. It was only 2 pages long. Yet in the officer's own handwriting, a single line was underlined twice. Doll in girl's possession is not of known manufacture. Appears foreign, possibly altered. The note ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted. Calloway and I sat in silence for a moment, the weight of that single sentence settling over us. There was no follow-up in the file, no evidence the doll had ever been recovered, or even that it had been properly searched for. It was as if the authorities had decided the less they pursued the matter, the better. People around here, Calloway finally said, they don't talk about Eleanor, but if you ask the oldest residents, they'll tell you the Harrow Gate stopped taking boarders within a year of her disappearance. Then, well, the building stood empty for decades, until it didn't. He wouldn't say more, not then. As I left the archive, I noticed something on the back of the photocopied police report, faint pencil markings, as if the page had been used as scrap for a list. A series of dates, each in a different year, with initials beside them. The earliest date was 1911, the latest 1974. I didn't know it yet, but those dates would lead me somewhere I never expected. By mid-afternoon, the fog had thinned to a pale film over Windermere's harbor. The Harrow Gate stood where the shore road began to climb, its clapboards silvered by salt and time. The porch rails had been repainted, but the older paint still cracked like the skin of a dried lake. I parked beneath a wind-twisted spruce and paused, listening. The house had the quiet that comes from being watched rather than abandoned. A brass plaque by the steps read, Harrow Gate C 1899. Below it, a smaller note. Private residence, caretaker on premises. I rang the bell, and the echo ran along the hallway, a sound with more space than a house this size should have. Footsteps approached unhurriedly. The door opened on a woman in her late 60s, with the calm eyes of someone who had made decisions for others most of her life. "You must be the researcher from the archive," she said, as if we had an appointment. "I'm Nora Vale. I look after the property for the trust." I gave her my name and explained the context. A photograph from 1911, a girl named Eleanor Duval, a doll with inexplicable details, and a police note that wouldn't leave me alone. She listened without impatience, then leaned her shoulder against the doorframe and examined the porch floorboards as if they might offer a verdict. "People still come by asking for stories," she said at last, "but you brought one with you." She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in, then. Daylight only." Inside, the Harrow Gate smelled faintly of orange oil and old paper. The entry hall ran straight as a spine to a wavy glass door at the rear. On the right, the parlor, on the dining room with a long table and a runner that didn't quite hide a water stain. Light fell upon the staircase where countless hands had turned. Above it, a gilt-framed mirror watched the hall with the resigned interest of someone who had seen worse. "We don't rent rooms," Nora said, leading me into the parlor. "Not anymore. The trust keeps it as a historic property. There's a committee that wants to open it for tours, but the committee doesn't sit here at night." She placed a key ring on the mantel, and for a moment the house seemed to lean toward the sound it made. I walked slowly, taking in the layout of the parlor. The fireplace, flanked by bookcases, the bay window whose glass rippled like water frozen in a photograph, an upright piano with its fallboard closed. A portrait hung above the piano depicting a woman in a high-necked dress, her features softened by the artist's hand, her gaze not quite meeting the room. "We found that in the attic when the trust took over," Nora said. "People say it's Eleanor's mother. No signature. The child's portrait, if there was one, didn't survive." "May I see the guest registers?" I asked. "Around 1911, but also later," she said. I found a list of dates and initials. "Someone wrote them on the back of a report. I think they were copied from somewhere," Nora said, studying me. Something in my voice must have suggested I wasn't trying to prove a legend, but to understand it. She nodded once and led me down the hall to a small office that had once been a pantry. Shelves held ledgers bound in brown cloth, indexed in a hand that improved for 20 years, then faded. "Take that chair," she said. "I'll make tea. It helps with the drafts." I opened the first ledger to 1911. Neat columns listed date, name, hometown, rate, room assignments penciled lightly in the margin, the work of someone who expected the future to remain readable without them. There it was, June 2nd, Duval E., family and residence. Below, a series of names meant nothing to me until I reached the final column, where someone had added initials months later in a different hand. EK appeared next to a line from the week after the photograph. 2 months on, another set of initials, FD, appeared with a date I recognized from the pencil list on the police copy. Each time the letters appeared, a gap in bookings followed. A week here, 10 days there, as if something had occurred that the ledger refused to describe, yet could not help recording through absence. When Nora returned with the tea, I showed her the pattern. She set the tray down and peered at the page without touching it. "I thought you said you found those letters on a report," she said. "I did, and here they are again. EK appears first in July 1911, then again in September 1912. FD shows up 3 times, 1924, 1929, 1932. The last set of initials appears in Bindoku's Yuzmish Dort. That would be the summer the last caretaker died." "Fell down the back stairs," they said. "No one wanted to live here after that. We closed it up. The trust formed 2 years later." "Who was EK?" Nora hesitated, then reached past me for a thin folder tucked between the ledgers. "The trust keeps a cross-reference, family names, legal filings, newspaper notices. EK was a Kessler seamstress, came from somewhere in Eastern Europe, lived in a boarding room on Bay Road, then moved out of town without registering." That's what the town clerk said. No forwarding address was ever found. She had been a guest twice, paid in cash, stayed 3 nights each time. The second stay ended 2 days before the Duval girl disappeared. We sat with that, a cold threading under the pantry door and across my ankles like a phantom cat. I asked to see the back stairs, and Nora led me past the dining room, down a narrow passage that sliced the light into ribbons, into a service hall where the wallpaper had been painted over so many times it had grown a skin. The back staircase was steep and straight. At its foot, the baseboard bore a scar where something heavy had struck. 1974, Nora said quietly. "If you're going to look, look now. I lock this part when the light goes." The steps groaned underfoot in the voice of old ships. On the landing, the air cooled further, as if we had crossed a seam in the house. I ran my fingertips along the banister and felt a rough patch where varnish had been worn or scraped away. Barely wider than a child's palm, a small oval polished by use and then scarred. When I raised my hand, my skin carried the faint scent of oil and linen. The hallway above turned left toward a row of narrow rooms. Most of the rooms were empty, their floors clean, windows closed against the sea. In the second room, a leftover iron bedstead had been pushed against the wall, and on the bed lay an object wrapped in muslin, no larger than a shoebox. Nora saw where I was looking and shook her head. "Found it in the ceiling joists years ago," she said. "The trust cataloged the contents, sealed it, and left it here." We don't move things with elastic histories. May I read the catalog note? She took a breath, then led me back to the office. In the folder marked Attic Finds, an index card in the same careful hand read, "Small parcel in muslin recovered from south guest room ceiling void. Second floor. Contents. One child's handkerchief, white linen embroidered CW. One length of black ribbon, frayed at ends. One cracked glass button. One scrap of dark fabric with stitching in a foreign pattern. No personal note. CW," I said. "Clara Winslow?" Nora lifted a hand. "In a different family, different loss." The house keeps its accounts in clusters. Do not assume all initials answer the same name. She was right. Of course, I had been too eager to let the ledger speak for me, but the card's last line held me, the scrap with foreign stitching. There was a pattern drawn beneath the description, a quick sketch by the cataloger as if to capture the texture of the thread. It resembled a chain of small diamonds with knots at their corners, the sort of pattern you could hide along the hem of a dress and only see when it moved. I asked to photograph the index card and the ledger pages. Nora agreed, watched me frame them carefully, then set her palm on the ledger as if to steady it, or to claim it back. The tea had cooled to the temperature of the house. I wrapped my fingers around the cup anyway and took a sip to wake my mouth. "What happened after 1911? I asked. "You said the house stood empty for decades until it didn't." She walked me back to the front hall and stopped at the mirror. In the glass, our reflection stood slightly out of reach, a fraction left of where we were. She lifted her hand, and for a moment the image did not lift with it. Then it followed, late by a breath. "Sometimes the house remembers faster than we do," she said. "We tried a reopening in the 1930s. Short-lived, another attempt in the early 70s. Shorter. People want water views and breakfast trays and a story that ends at checkout. The Harrow Gate doesn't end. It holds." On the porch, the light had softened to the color of paper saved too long in a box. I thanked her and promised to share anything I found that might clarify the ledger's letters. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pressed something into my hand, a small old-fashioned key on a ribbon. "Archives room key," she said. "Not for here, for a cabinet at the Windermere Museum. The trust deposits some things where more eyes can argue over them. There's a drawer labeled Kessler. If you're going to pull on a thread, pull the one that's already fraying." The key was smooth with use. It left a crescent of cool metal on my palm. When I looked up, Nora had turned back inside. The door closed with the measured care of someone not wishing to wake a sleeping house, but the latch clicked with a certainty that felt less like sleep and more like a promise given and kept. At the curb, I took one last look at the upper windows. In the smallest pane of the south guest room, something glinted as if a button had caught the light. It was nothing, surely only the glass holding the day in a different shape. Even so, I wrote it down. On the drive back into town, I thought about the initials in the ledger and the dates on the penciled list. EK first, then others who had come and left their letters behind like fingerprints, not on surfaces, but on time. I had believed the story began with a photograph, but what I held now was a line of entries leading outward from the Harrow Gate into Windermere and beyond. It was nearly closing when I reached the museum. The desk attendant, a student with ink on his fingers, checked the key against a clipboard and led me to a narrow room lined with metal cabinets. The one marked local families. Immigrants creaked when I turned the small key in its older lock. Inside, the folders were arranged with disciplined thrift. I found the tab labeled Kessler E and slid the file free. There were 2 photographs. In the first, a young woman stood beside a low fence with the sea behind her, her hair parted cleanly and pinned under a scarf. Her eyes were direct, not defiant, but unwilling to feign modesty. In the crook of her arm, she held a bundle wrapped in cloth, the edge of porcelain peeking out where the fabric pulled away. The second photograph had been taken in a studio, the backdrop painted with a column and a draped curtain. The same woman sat with her hands folded. On the small table beside her stood a doll with a porcelain head, its painted mouth closed as if it had never learned to open. On the back of the studio portrait, written in the same hand as the ledger notes, was a single word I could not translate. It seemed both a name and a warning. Posit. I returned the photograph to its envelope, feeling the hair on my arms rise, as though the room itself had become self-conscious. Somewhere in the building, a clock struck the hour with the light step of a museum timepiece. The attendant appeared at the door silently, raising an eyebrow to ask if I would be much longer. I thanked him, relocked the cabinet, and stepped out into the evening. The sky over Windermere had shifted toward the color of the deep water beyond the reef. Between the house that held its breath and the cabinet that held its names, a path had opened. Ed Kessler had brought something to this town, perhaps two of something, and the Harrow Gate had done what houses do when objects arrive with histories. It made room, and then it kept the room. I thought of the glass plate from 1911, of a little girl looking just past the lens, and of a doll whose eyes reflected more than they were meant to hold. I thought of a word written in a hand that bridged a ledger, a portrait, and a list with dates that never seemed to end. The road home ran along the harbor like a line drawn to underline the town. I followed it as if doing so would help me understand. The photograph, now carefully held by the Marchwell Historical Society, had drawn more attention than anyone anticipated. By early spring, the Society's usually quiet building saw a steady trickle of visitors. Locals, out-of-town enthusiasts, even a few professional archivists specializing in early 20th century visual records. Many came only to stand before the glass case where the image was displayed, squinting and leaning closer, searching for the details that had unsettled so many. Miss Fletcher, ever the guardian of decorum, noticed a pattern. Visitors rarely lingered. Some whispered to one another before moving away, while others left altogether, as if something in the image had shifted their appetite for historical curiosity. She began keeping a discreet notebook of their reactions, recording each fleeting look of discomfort, every involuntary step backward. It was during this period that a man named Edward Raines arrived at the Society. He introduced himself as a researcher from the University of Brighton, specializing in photographic anomalies. His tone was polite, yet there was a calculated sharpness in the way he examined both the photograph and Miss Fletcher's notes. Raines spent nearly 2 hours studying the image under magnification, speaking little and frowning at intervals. When he finally stepped away, he asked to see any documented history of the Talford family. Land deeds, census records, anything that might trace their movements before and after 1911. The archive revealed a curious pattern. The Talfords had lived in Grey Court only briefly before vanishing from public records entirely in 1913. No obituaries, no property transfers, no immigration documents, just a blank space where a family's paper trail should have been. Miss Fletcher felt a prickling unease as she watched Raines thumb through brittle ledgers, his eyes darting from one faded line of ink to another. "I've seen gaps like this before," he murmured, almost to himself, yet never with so many witnesses willing to say nothing. Over the next week, Raines returned daily. He began asking pointed questions, not only about the Talfords, but about the land their home had occupied and about 2 small graves listed in an 1898 church registry, both unmarked on the present-day cemetery map. Miss Fletcher realized then that his interest extended far beyond the photograph. Late one afternoon, when the building had grown quiet and rain tapped steadily against the tall windows, Raines leaned over her desk and lowered his voice. "The dolls," he said, "are older than the girl. They're not Romanian, not entirely." The way he said it made the hair along her arms rise. That night, Miss Fletcher locked the photograph in the archive storage room and sat alone at her kitchen table, staring into her tea until it went cold. She thought of the girl's expression, neither a smile nor a frown, but something in between, as if she knew more than she should for her age, and wondered for the first time whether bringing the image into public view had been a mistake. Rains arrived earlier than usual the next morning, his coat still wet from the drizzle. Under his arm, he carried a thin leather portfolio, worn at the edges as though opened and closed countless times. Miss Fletcher noticed that his usual reserved demeanor had been replaced by a sharp urgency that unsettled her before he spoke. Without preamble, he laid several black and white photographs on her desk. They were not of the Talford girl, but of other children taken decades earlier, each holding a doll of striking similarity. The same fixed porcelain stare, the same intricate stitching along the hems of their miniature dresses. The earliest of these images dated back to 1849. "These dolls," Rhys said, tapping one of the photographs with a gloved finger, "have appeared in images across 3 continents over more than 60 years, always in the hands of a child, always in towns later marked by sudden disappearances." His voice was low but steady, and Miss Fletcher found herself leaning in, despite the unease curling in her stomach. He spoke of an obscure maker, a craftsman whose name appeared only in fragments, scraps of letters, half-legible shipping invoices, linked to ports in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. Yet the material of the dolls was not native to any single region. Their porcelain contained trace elements from quarries that should never have been connected. What troubled Rains most, however, was not the doll's origin, but their movement. They reappeared, he said, as if passed from one child to another. Not sold, not gifted, but transferred under circumstances no one could explain. He showed her a ledger page from 1882 belonging to a now-defunct orphanage in Northland, listing 2 dolls sent away for safekeeping just days before the facility abruptly closed. The handwriting was careful, almost ceremonial, as if recording something far more significant than a simple exchange of toys. Miss Fletcher studied the Talford girl's photograph again, her eyes drawn not to the child's face, but to her hands. She noticed how the fingers gripped the dolls, not with the casual clutch of play, but with a strange firmness, almost possessive, as if holding them was a condition she could not refuse. A faint chill crept into her chest. That afternoon, Rains requested permission to visit the site where the Talford home had once stood. The plot of land, long since reclaimed by wild growth, lay on the outskirts of town, a place few locals ventured. He proposed they go together at the week's end, when the weather promised to clear. Miss Fletcher hesitated, sensing that this step would carry them beyond archival curiosity into something neither could easily explain. But she agreed. That night, she pulled from her shelves every record of foreign arrivals in Grey Court between 1900 and 1911. In the quiet of her old house, she read about a shipment declared simply as household goods, received at the port 3 months before the Talfords moved to town. There was no list of contents, no consignee's name, just a single smudged initial beside the word "delivered." By the time Miss Fletcher and Rains set out for the outskirts of Grey Court, the rain had cleared. The path to the old Talford property was narrow and half-hidden, overgrown with brambles that snagged their coats. The air carried the damp, earthy scent left by a storm. But beneath it lingered something else. Faint, metallic, almost like the taste of a coin held too long in the mouth. The land was silent, save for the occasional caw of a distant crow. The Talford house itself was long gone, consumed by time and neglect. In its place stood the skeletal outline of a stone foundation, its corners softened by moss. A single chimney rose stubbornly from the ruins, blackened near the top as though fire had licked it in its final days. Rains circled the site deliberately, his boots sinking into the sodden ground. He paused near what might once have been the front steps and crouched, brushing away a layer of wet leaves. Beneath them lay a shard of white porcelain, half buried in the soil. It was smooth on one side, fractured on the other, with a trace of faded blue paint curving like the corner of a tiny eye. Miss Fletcher's breath caught, She knelt beside him, touching the fragment only with the tip of her glove. It was unmistakable. The same material, the same delicate finish as the dolls in the photographs, but this piece bore hairline cracks spreading in deliberate, almost symmetrical patterns, like veins etched by a hand rather than random breakage. They pressed on, following the faint outline of the back garden. At the farthest edge of the property, they discovered the remains of a wooden fence, its posts leaning drunkenly under the weight of ivy. Just beyond it lay a shallow depression in the earth, unnaturally oval, as if something had been buried there long ago and the ground had settled unevenly. Rains retrieved a small trowel from his satchel and began to dig. The soil was loamy, easier to turn than expected. Within minutes, the trowel struck wood. They exchanged a glance. Working together, they cleared away the dirt until a small, rotting box emerged. The wood was spongy with age, and the nails were rusted a dull orange. When they lifted the lid, the hinges gave way with a soft groan. Inside, wrapped in layers of what had once been silk but now crumbled at their touch, was another doll, intact, yet with an unnerving pallor to its porcelain face. Its eyes, painted in a glassy shade of blue, seemed almost wet. The dress, though tattered, was finely made, the tiny buttons carved from mother of pearl. Miss Fletcher felt the weight of it in her hands. It was heavier than it should have been, as if more than clay and paint filled its form. And though the day was mild, the doll's porcelain was cold enough to sting her fingers. Rains closed the box without a word, jaw tight. "We need to see the inside of this," he said. "But not here. Not where it has rested for who knows how many years." They agreed to take it back to his study, where his equipment could handle delicate work. As they walked toward town, Miss Fletcher couldn't shake the feeling that the doll's eyes had shifted slightly during the journey, as if aware of being moved. Back in Raines's study, the light from the tall leaded windows faded into the muted gold of early evening. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, and the low tick of a mantel clock seemed to slow as Miss Fletcher set the box on the broad oak desk. She removed her gloves with deliberate care, as though any sudden movement might disturb the fragile secret the doll held. Raines brought over a tray of tools, fine brushes, a jeweler's loupe, and slender picks meant for archaeological work. He did not open the box immediately. Instead, he circled it, studying every inch of its exterior as if the wood itself might conceal a message. The grain was warped with moisture, and the lid bore faint indentations that might once have been letters, now worn nearly invisible. At last, he lifted the lid. The doll lay exactly as they had found it, swaddled in the last shreds of silk. Up close, its features were unsettlingly precise. The skin tone bore the faintest pink flush, unlike the flat white of ordinary porcelain, and the glass eyes caught the lamplight, giving them startling depth. "Look here," Raines murmured, leaning in with the loupe. He pointed to the faint seam running along the back of the head, barely visible beneath tangled remnants of hair. Most dolls had such seams from the mold, but this one appeared uneven, as if it had been opened and resealed at some point. He fetched a thin scalpel and, with a steadiness born of years in the field, began to work at the seam. The sound was faint, almost like paper being torn softly. After several careful minutes, the top of the head lifted away with unnatural ease. Inside, there was no empty cavity. Instead, tightly packed into the hollow was a bundle of aged paper folded with meticulous care. Raines eased it out with tweezers, and the air seemed cooler, sharper, as though the room itself drew in a breath. The paper crackled softly as Miss Fletcher unfolded it. The ink had browned with age, but the writing remained clear. It was a letter in looping script, dated July 18th, 1911, the same summer the photograph had been taken. The message was brief, but each word felt heavy. "They will not listen, so I have hidden what she carries. Do not let her out. If you find her, bury her deeper, for her sake and ours." Beneath the words was a signature neither recognized, but the surname froze Miss Fletcher in her tracks. It matched that of the little girl in the photograph. They sat in silence, the clock ticking like a slow heartbeat. The doll stared up from the desk, its eyes glinting in the lamplight as if aware the letter had been discovered. The surname on the letter lay between them like a challenge neither dared voice. Miss Fletcher finally broke the silence in a low voice. If that is truly her family name, there must be records, parish logs, census lists, perhaps even burial registers. Raines leaned back in his chair, the lamplight cutting deep lines across his face. And if there are, he said, we will find out why someone thought burying a doll was safer than letting it remain in that child's hands. That very evening, they began their search. Raines retrieved a stack of brittle census ledgers from the archives beneath the study. Fletcher took the parish records, their vellum pages darkened with decades of candle smoke. They worked in near silence, the air thick with the smell of paper and dust. Every so often, one would pause, pen poised over a notepad, only to shake their head and continue searching. Near midnight, Miss Fletcher froze, her fingertip resting on a faded entry in the burial register for August 1911. A single name, a child, 7 years old. The surname matched the one they sought, but the margin carried a stark note, cause withheld by order of magistrate. No illness, no accident, just a quiet refusal to explain. The next day, they visited the county hall, where public access to court archives was, at least in theory, possible. The clerk, an older man with thinning hair and a practiced smile, listened politely to their request. But when Raines mentioned the family name, the smile vanished, replaced by a wary expression. I don't believe you'll find much from that year, the clerk said, shuffling papers in a way that avoided their eyes. A fire destroyed most of those files. Raines pressed on. What about before the fire? The clerk hesitated, then reached under the counter and produced a slim, leather-bound docket, its edges blackened as if it had barely survived the flames. This is all that remains. Inside, the handwriting was cramped and hurried. One entry, dated 2 weeks before the child's death, mentioned a complaint lodged by neighbors about strange disturbances at the family home, noises, lights at odd hours, and voices that seemed not to belong to the living. Miss Fletcher closed the docket slowly. They weren't just burying a toy, she said. They were trying to bury whatever came with it. As they left the hall, the sky had turned a tarnished silver, the air restless with the promise of rain. Neither spoke during the walk back, each haunted by the thought that whatever had clung to that doll might not have stayed underground. By the time Raines and Fletcher reached the edge of Milford's eastern lane, rain had begun in earnest. The road narrowed into a rutted track, slick with mud and flanked by skeletal hedges that clawed at their coats. Ahead, partially hidden behind overgrown hawthorn, stood the house. It was smaller than either expected. 2 stories, its roof sagging, chimney leaning like a tired sentinel. Shutters hung crooked, some missing entirely, revealing dark, empty windows that stared at the lane like unblinking eyes. This is it, Fletcher whispered, clutching the old property map they had borrowed from the records office. The family had lived here until they didn't. They pushed open the rusted gate, its hinges shrieking, and stepped into a front garden overrun by wild grass. The path was nearly gone, but a faint outline led to the front door, which stood slightly ajar, as if expecting them. Inside, the air was stale from decades of disuse, tinged with something sharper, old wood and faint soot. Raines's torch beam swept across the front room, a collapsed armchair like a cold, blackened hearth, and wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips to reveal the lath beneath. Fletcher found the staircase, running her fingers along the banister, feeling the grit of dust and the give of weakened wood. At the top, the landing branched into 2 small bedrooms and a narrow door at the far end. The first bedroom held nothing but a rusted iron bed frame. In the second, beneath the window, stood a small wooden chest. Its surface was scratched, as if something had clawed at it in frustration. Fletcher knelt, brushing away cobwebs. There's a lock, she murmured. Raines tried it, but the rusted clasp refused to yield. Let's see what's behind the narrow door. he said, stepping into the dim corridor. The door opened onto an attic barely tall enough to stand in. The floorboards groaned beneath them, and the air was noticeably colder. At the center of the room was a shallow depression in the wood, no larger than a child's footprint. Fletcher crouched, tracing its outline. The surface was smooth, worn by years of standing in the same spot. Then she noticed something wedged between two boards. A fragment of faded blue fabric, a single pearl button still attached. She glanced at Rains, and neither spoke. They both recognized the color. It matched the dress the little girl wore in the photograph. A sudden creak from downstairs made them both turn. The front door, which had been ajar, now stood wide open. Beyond it, the rain had stopped. A figure stood just past the sagging gate, framed by dripping hawthorn. He was tall and wiry, his coat patched in places up, the brim of his hat pulled low, shadowing his eyes. Even from a distance, Rains felt the man's gaze pierce them, his stillness sharper than the chill in the air. Fletcher froze beside him. "Do you know him?" she whispered. "No," Rains replied, though his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "But—" Something about the man's stance, hands folded behind his back, chin slightly down, suggested he had been waiting. The stranger did not move as they stepped outside, but only shifted his gaze toward the open door, measuring what they had seen. When Rains began to speak, the man raised a finger, not to silence them, but as if to pause the moment entirely. "You're trespassing," he said at last, his voice gravely but steady. "This place isn't for visitors. Not now. Not ever." Rains stepped closer, unwilling to retreat without answers. "You knew the family who lived here." The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "I knew what happened after. That's all you need to know." His eyes lingered on Fletcher longer than was comfortable. "And if you're wise, you'll burn whatever you came looking for." With that, he turned sharply, boots crunching on wet gravel, and walked down the lane without looking back. The silence he left behind was heavier than the storm that had passed. "Back inside," Fletcher said, kneeling again by the locked chest. "If he's warning us off, it means there's something worth finding." Her fingers worked at the rusted clasp until it snapped with brittle resistance. The lid lifted on protesting hinges, revealing a neatly folded child's dress, the same faded blue as the scrap in the attic, alongside a small notebook tied with fraying string. The cover was soft from use, its edges darkened with age. On the first page, in an unsteady child's hand, were 3 words, "Don't open this." Fletcher looked at Rains. "It's not locked." He hesitated, the stranger's warning still echoing in his mind, but curiosity pulled him forward. Slowly, he untied the string, which slipped away like it had given up its last resistance. Rains eased open the cover, expecting words, dates, perhaps names, but instead found drawings. The first page showed a crude sketch of a little girl in a long dress, her eyes nothing but empty ovals, standing beside a tall figure whose head seemed swallowed in shadow. Beneath them, in shaky lettering, were the words, "He stands in the orchard." He turned the page. The next drawing was hurried, the pencil lines pressed deep into the paper. It showed the same girl again, now holding one of the strange dolls from the attic, its face smudged over entirely, as if erased in anger. Written across the top was a single line, "She won't let me speak." Fletcher leaned in, her shoulder brushing his. "These aren't just a child's doodles," she murmured. "They're warnings." As they flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. Less drawing, more frantic writing. Words ran into one another, spelling errors piling up as if the hand that wrote them could not keep pace with its thoughts. "The orchard watches. The dolls are her hands. Do not come here after the frost." By the final entries, the handwriting was nearly illegible, but one date stood out clearly, November 3rd, 1911. Beneath it, only 2 words were written, circled over and over until the paper nearly tore through. "Under roots." They stared at the page in silence. The orchard lay just behind the house, its twisted apple trees still heavy with the last stubborn leaves of autumn. Rains closed the notebook carefully, as if it might crumble. "If she meant literal roots, we need to look tonight," he said. Fletcher's gaze drifted to the darkened window. "And if she didn't mean literal," Rain said, "then we're in far deeper trouble than I thought." They found the orchard by lantern light, the air thick with the damp scent of earth. The gnarled trees stood close together, their branches creaking softly in the wind. Somewhere among them, hidden beneath the soil, lay whatever secret the notebook's author had been desperate to mark. The soil was stubborn, packed hard with years of fallen leaves and rain-swollen roots. Each thrust of the spade sent a dull vibration up Rains's arms, the metal biting into earth that smelled older than memory. Fletcher knelt nearby with a smaller hand trowel, scooping away loosened clumps and glancing over her shoulder every few minutes as if expecting someone or something to be watching from between the trees. The lantern's light made the orchard seem smaller, shadows pressing tight against them. Their breath rose in pale clouds, mingling in the cold night air. The first sound came after only a few minutes of digging, a faint, hollow clink. Rains froze, the spade still in the dirt. He brushed away loose soil until a dull gleam of metal emerged, a curved, rusted hinge. Working carefully, he widened the hole until more of it was visible. It wasn't just a hinge, it was part of a small iron-bound chest, no bigger than a bread box, its wood darkened and swollen from years underground. Fletcher's hands hovered above it, but did not touch. If this is what she meant, it's been down here longer than either of us have been alive. Rains slid his fingers under one edge and tugged. The chest resisted, its weight far greater than it should have been for its size. When they finally freed it from the roots, the lantern light caught on something strange. Thin strands wrapped around it. They looked like twine, but the strands were brittle, pale, and far too organic. Fletcher leaned closer, her expression tightening. "That's not twine." The lock was a simple iron clasp bent inward, as if forced shut from the outside. Rains hesitated, the notebook's warning, "Do not come here after the frost," echoing in his mind. But the chill in the air and the emptiness of the orchard felt like frost enough, and the choice to wait had already slipped from them the moment they started digging. With a single push of his thumb, the clasp gave way. The lid creaked open, releasing a breath of air so cold and stale it made them both flinch. Inside, packed in straw rotted to dust, lay a doll. Its dress was intact, fine cotton patterned with faded roses, but the head, carved wood, was simple yet eerily lifelike. Two black glass eyes caught the lantern light and seemed for an instant to reflect something moving behind them. Beneath the doll, half buried in the dust, lay another object, folded parchment, yellowed but still whole. On its outer fold, written in ink the color of dried blood, were the same two words from the notebook, "Underroots." Rain unfolded the parchment slowly, careful not to tear its fragile fibers. The paper crackled faintly, releasing a scent like damp cellar stone. By the lantern's glow, the writing emerged, faded but precise, the penmanship of someone accustomed to formality. For the eyes of those who would remember what must not be repeated, the words sent a strange tremor through him. Beneath the opening line was a list. Dates, each paired with a single name. The earliest date was 1872, the most recent 1911. Every name was female, every age beside them was under 12. The final entry read, Clara Hensley, age 8, September 4th, 1911. Fletcher's breath caught. "That's her," she whispered, as if speaking it aloud might summon something, the little girl from the photograph. Beneath the list lay a rough sketch of the orchard, as it must have been over a century ago. Rows of trees were marked with tiny circles, several shaded in dark ink. Near the bottom of the page, a final instruction had been scrawled hastily. "Do not disturb the shaded ground." They sat in silence, the orchard suddenly louder in its stillness. Leaves shifted above, though no wind stirred. Raindrops glanced toward the nearest shaded spot on the map. It was only a few steps from where they had unearthed the chest. Fletcher closed the parchment and slid it into her coat pocket. "We should put it back," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't fully believe her own words. Before they could decide, the lantern flickered. Its flame guttered once, twice, then steadied. In that brief dimness, Rains thought he saw something standing between the trees, small, motionless, watching. When the light returned, the space was empty. The orchard, however, felt closer now, as if the rows of trees had inched inward. They left in a hurry, the chest cradled between them, the parchment pressed flat in Fletcher's pocket, as if holding it tighter could contain its contents from leaking into the night. The grass brushed their legs along what they assumed was the same narrow path they had used to reach the trees. After several minutes, Rains realized the slope felt wrong. The moonlight seemed dimmer, shrouded in a haze that hadn't been there before. He stopped, scanning the horizon. "This isn't the way we came," he said. Fletcher turned slowly, her breath visible in the cooling air. It has to be. There was only one path. Yet when they looked back, the orchard had vanished, not merely hidden, gone entirely. In its place stretched a dark meadow toward a stand of pine trees neither of them remembered. A low sound drifted across the grass, faint at first, then growing distinct. It was a steady humming, devoid of melody, as though a dozen voices held a single note. The sound pressed against their ears, soft, but impossible to ignore. Rains felt a tug in his chest, like the pull of the tide, both inviting and dangerous. "Keep walking," Fletcher urged, though her steps faltered. "Don't listen to it." Yet the humming followed, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. The air thickened with the faint scent of apples long past their sweetness. Rains's mind flashed to the parchment, the shaded circles, the final warning. Do not disturb the shaded ground. They quickened their pace. The meadow gave way to uneven earth. Shapes loomed in the distance, tall, thin, unmoving. At first, Rains thought they were fence posts. A chill ran down his spine as he realized they were gravestones, worn by more than a century of wind and rain. They were small, too small for adults, each marked not with names or dates, but with a single carved image, a doll. Its features simplified to an oval head, a round body, arms curling inward as if cradling something unseen. Rains crouched before the nearest stone, brushing away moss at its base. The carving was shallow, yet unmistakable. "They're all the same," he murmured. Fletcher moved from grave to grave, her flashlight catching the identical figures. She stopped at the farthest stone, startled, except for this one. It was slightly taller, the carving more deliberate. In the doll's arms was a smaller figure, a second doll. Beneath it, chiseled by an unpracticed but determined hand, were the words, "For the one who stayed behind." A wind picked up, rustling the grass. Rains scanned the meadow, but the hum had ceased. The silence felt heavier than the sound had been. The chest in Fletcher's hands seemed to pulse with weight. "We need to leave this here," she said quietly. He hesitated. "If we do, we'll never know what's inside." "Maybe we already know," she replied, glancing at the row of stones, "and maybe we're not meant to open it." Rains tightened his grip, the choice pressing on him like the surrounding darkness. He thought of the vanished orchard, the shifting path, the voices in the hum, and the little girl in the photograph, doll clutched to her chest, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. In the end, they placed the chest before the tallest stone. Fletcher set the parchment atop it. The paper fluttered once before settling. Without another word, they walked into the meadow, not looking back. Hours later, when they reached the gravel road, the first light of dawn was breaking. The air smelled of earth and dew, clean and ordinary. Yet in the quiet, Rains could swear he heard it again, faint, like the memory of a song.